Roundup Live. We're going to be getting started with our show in just a couple of minutes. But before we do that, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items with you. Number one is that we're going to be getting started with our show in just a couple of minutes. But before we do that, I'm getting some feedback. Okay, I'll continue here. So before we get started, I wanted to go over some housekeeping. So number one is that we do have a really great LinkedIn community. So if you happen to have questions at any time, really, you can join us at our community. Govology Nation is what it's called. To get to that group, all you have to do is go to govology.com/nation, and you can request to join, and we'll get you in there. So again, if you have any other questions about government contracting or anything that we discussed in our show today that you wanted to ask, but you didn't get a chance to, you can also go there and post it to our LinkedIn channel. Also, so for those of you guys who are joining us for the live show today, we are going to run for 60 minutes. And the format is for about the first 30 to 45 minutes, we're going to be talking about the topic of the day. And then we're going to have a live post-show Q&A for about 15 to 20 minutes after that. So if you want to ask questions during the show, there's two ways to do that. You can raise your hand using the little control panel, raise your hand feature, and we'll take questions at the end. So if you just hang tight, we'll unmute your mic and you can ask your question live. And your other option is to type your question into the Q&A box, and we'll get to the questions as we go. So if you want to catch us on demand, we are recording the show, and we will be posting that to our YouTube channel, and you can get there by going to govology.com/YouTube. And you can also listen to us on Spotify if you want to check it out on your drive to work or your morning walk. It's another great way to access the content here of the show. One last thing is our legal disclaimers. So the information shared during our GovCon live show, including the Q&A session, is for general purposes only and does not constitute legal advice. Viewers should not act upon this information without seeking professional counsel. And with that, we're going to take a pause, and then we'll resume our show here shortly. All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 3 of GovCon Live. I'm GovCon Roundup Live. My name is Carol Bernard, a co-founder of Govology.com, and I'm joined by my co-host, retired GovCon attorney, regulations expert, the man, the myth, the legend, Mr. Stephen Koprince. Hey, Stephen, how you doing today?
Hey, doing just fine, Carol. You got to keep pumping me up in these introductions. It helps my ego, so I appreciate that. So happy to be here again. Always fun to have these chats with you in these kind of more informal setting here with our GovCon Roundup Live. So looking forward to today's.
Awesome, man. Hey, I love doing these shows with you. And today we've got another interesting topic to discuss related to the FAR overhaul. And there's been just so many things that have been talked about in the media, in the news, everywhere. So many things are happening. Today, we're going to be talking about the latest round of proposals from the Office of Management and Budget. In fact, there were 16 proposals that were sent to Congress. We're only really going to talk about 3 of those today just because of the time limitations. But for those of you who want to take a look at all of the 16 proposals, if you just go and Google OMB 16 proposals, you'll find some links to some blog articles, as well as to likely the GSA website itself, where they have these 16 proposals listed. So we're going to get into this today, Stephen, but I thought because 2 of the 3, especially that we're going to be discussing, that's going to have some impact to small business, will also likely have some impacts to the rule of 2. And I thought that a good starting point, especially for the folks that may be new to GovCon, or simply for those of us who may just need a refresher on the rule of 2 and as it stands right now, maybe you could start to talk about that. What is the rule of 2? What is the current threshold, and kind of how the rule of 2 works, as well as this the part two to this question is like, what is going on with the rule of two? Because we've heard some things where it seems like some folks are trying to get rid of it, while there's at the same time been a bill introduced to Congress to codify the rule of two into law, which we're hoping will go through. And for those of you guys who are online with us today, we encourage you to go out and talk to your congressional reps and senators to encourage them to codify the rule of two into law. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Stephen. Maybe you can kind of give us a general, quick overview of this rule of two and where it stands today.
Yeah, and that's I think a good place to start because it also lets me try to at least set the stage in terms of some of the just the bigger picture of what we're looking at here in terms of statutes, in terms of regulations, in terms of what this revolutionary FAR overhaul process can achieve if it wants to on its own versus what Congress needs to do, which gets us back to these GSA recommendations. Because what GSA or OMB has done has gone beyond what the revolutionary FAR overhaul process can achieve on its own through its own regulatory authority to things that only Congress can change. And so this is OMB saying, hey, Congress, we can't do this. We'd like to. Can you do it for us? And so that's where these 16 proposals come in. And so the rule of two really is going to be at the centerpiece of what we're talking about for at least a couple of these topics today regarding the micro purchase threshold and especially the simplified acquisition threshold. And so the rule of two is really the centerpiece of the government's efforts, and it has been for decades, to meet a statutory mandate. A statute, of course, is the thing that Congress adopts, is passed into law. It's, the bill on the Hill, House and Senate pass the bill, President signs it into law typically. And that's the law of the land. It can become law with over the president's signature or whatever. We're not going to get into that. Law of the land. It's what it's called. It's codified in the U.S. Code or USC. So if you see USC, we're not talking about the Trojans or the Gamecocks in this setting. We're talking about the United States Code, and that's the law of the land. And so in the United States Code, in the parts involving contracting, there is a mandate that the government give small businesses the fair opportunity to compete for and receive contract awards. And so there is also a specific mandate in statute now. Again, this is the law of the land. Only Congress can amend or revoke a statute. Congress passed the statute. Only Congress can amend or revoke the statute. Congress has adopted by statute what's called a rule of two and that's a colloquial term. That's not what the statute says, but that's what everyone in the procurement field calls it. For contract actions that are anticipated, the value is going to be between what's called the micro purchase threshold and the simplified acquisition threshold. And so under statute, the micro purchase threshold currently is $10,000. The simplified acquisition threshold, $250,000. And so between those dollar values, and that's a $240,000 range, what the statute says is that small businesses, those contract actions must be set aside. In other words, only small businesses can compete for and be awarded those contracts whenever the contracting officer has a reasonable expectation that two or more small businesses are likely to submit offers at fair market prices. And so if that rule of two, if you've got two competitors or more, then by statute, by law of the land, then only small businesses can compete for and receive those awards. And what happens with the statute is that it's typically then expanded upon and implemented through a regulation that's published in the CFR. That's the Code of Federal Regulations. And that has happened with this rule of two between the micro purchase and simplified acquisition threshold. That has been published at in the FAR. FAR is part of the CFR, by the way. So FAR is just a Title 48 of the CFR. That has been published at FAR 19.502-2. And so you have under that, under FAR 19.502-2, the requirement that between the micro purchase and simplified acquisition thresholds, small businesses receive the contract opportunities. They're set aside for small business whenever there's likely going to be two or more small business competitors. However, the FAR Council, which is the entity that writes the FAR, using its independent regulatory authority, has gone beyond the bare minimum requirements of the statute, because the FAR Council also has the mandate to achieve the congressional goal of providing that fair opportunity for small businesses to compete for contract awards. And the FAR Council is looking at that government-wide goal, the government-wide goal that small businesses receive at least 23% of prime contracting dollars every year. And so the tool that the FAR Council has adopted to get there, to meet and achieve that 23% goal and provide that fair opportunity, is to essentially take the mandate for the rule of two between the micro purchase and simplified acquisition thresholds and say, you know what, we're essentially doing that a slightly less strict version of that, but we're doing essentially that above the simplified acquisition threshold too. And so, slightly oversimplifying things, that under the current FAR, the rule of two applies to anything over the micro purchase threshold. It's a slightly stricter application between the micro purchase and simplified acquisition thresholds, but under FAR 19.5022, the same concept applies above the micro purchase threshold as well. That when you have two or more qualified, capable small businesses likely to submit offers at fair market prices, you got to set aside the work for small business or use some other small business vehicle like an 8A contract, something like that. So that's where we come today. We have this statutory mandate for the rule of two at certain dollar values. We have a regulatory mandate for the rule of two at higher dollar values. And that's where, when we talk about codifying the rule of two, there's been a lot of concern in the marketplace, the government contracting small business marketplace, that this revolutionary FAR overhaul process could do away with the rule of two above the simplified acquisition threshold, because you don't need Congress's approval to do that. The FAR Council passed that regulation. It can pull that regulation back. And so when we talk about codifying the rule of two, what we mean is writing a statute that says, you know what, we said between the simplified acquisition threshold and micro purchase threshold in our USC and our US code, but now we're saying that it applies at all dollar values. And we're not just saying it in the FAR, we're saying it in statute. And so there are bills now in the House or Senate that would do that out of concern that potentially, and we don't know that this will happen, this revolutionary FAR overhaul process could eliminate the rule of two mandate above the simplified acquisition threshold, thereby essentially undermining one of the key vehicles toward providing small businesses with contracting opportunities of the federal government.
All righty. So as it stands now, just a quick recap, I want to touch on these thresholds one more time, because this kind of gets to be a very important aspect of the first two proposals that we're going to discuss today. So $10,000, that's the micro purchase threshold, with the exception of construction and services that have prevailing wage rates in it. Those are a little bit lower. And then that goes up to $250,000. Within that range, then you've got some regulations stating that if there's two or more small businesses, the contracting officers shall make a set aside for small business, right?
Yeah, that's it. And keep in mind that below the micro purchase threshold, it's kind of just game on. That's where you're using your government credit card or government purchase card. There's no small business set aside requirements. It's very, very loose in terms of the requirements of the buy. And so that's below that threshold. That's kind of where the government runs over to Office Depot or whatever, plops down the credit card and buys the printer ink it needs right away, or whatever the case is. That's kind of that's not necessarily how it's working, but that's the idea, is that below that threshold, we're not going to worry about paperwork of doing a set aside and all these sorts of things. That's below the $10,000.
Yeah. So, and that below the threshold kind of becomes very important to some of these next two proposals, that were the top of the threshold and the bottom of the threshold. So I'm going to read the two basic overviews of what's being proposed in two of the three things that we're going to discuss today. Then we'll kind of get your feedback on these, and we'll have some questions about this. So the first is streamlining compliance and competition procedural requirements. So this proposal would raise the simplified acquisition threshold for commercial products and services from $250,000 as it is currently set today to $10 million over 5 years, and increase the limits for special simplified procedures from $5 million to $50 million in the same time frame. And the goal is to streamline compliance, reduce competition-related procedural burdens, and speed time to mission, is what it says. So uh, the second proposal on this is a separate one, which is going to be common sense procedures for small purchases. So now this one affects the bottom of the threshold, right? So this proposal would raise the micro purchase threshold in phases from $10,000 to $100,000 over 5 years, removing government unique barriers for the small business buys while keeping the Buy American in place, the Buy American Act in place to ensure domestic sourcing remains a priority for buyers and sellers. So now, with what you just said about the current threshold being 10 million to 250,000, or 10,000 to $250,000, and you just also said that, under that threshold, there's no really requirements for small business set aside. So when we take a look at that second one, if that's going to go up to $100,000, effectively, it'll take out $90,000 off of that range. But the other part of that range is moving up. So can you explain this? Because it's
Yeah.
kind of confusing. And if the range moves up to $10 million, or what was it, 10 million? Yeah. So if the range goes from 250 to 10 million, and if this goes through, and let's just say the new range is $100,000 to $10 million, now does the rule of two start to apply to the new simplified acquisition threshold?
Yeah, and the answer is going to be no, and I'll tell you why in a second. So
Well,
first
that
things first, this
sucks.
is just kind of something that amuses me is that when you read this list of the OMB's proposals here, somebody put this through like the marketing spin doctor people, because several of these proposals, or at least a couple of them, have the word common sense tag in front of them, including, by the way, the proposal to charge you fees for registering in SAM. They call that common sense fees. I'm like, I thought it was common sense to not charge me for this stuff, but now they put it in a place where if anyone opposes this proposal, it's like, well, you're against common sense, you know. So you can tell that somebody with a background in that kind of spin doctoring world had a hand in naming some of these proposals with an eye toward the pushback and setting it up so that anyone who pushes back is against common sense, even when it comes to charging fees for registering in SAM, which is not a proposal we're going to talk about today, but has gotten ink at attention elsewhere. Um, so yeah, let's start with the micro purchase part of it. It's that moving the floor up, and of course, you understand why GSA and OMB are interested in this, because remember, there's more going on here than just the small business stuff, and we got to keep that in mind as well. I'm a small business advocate. I look at everything with the small business lens, and so I'm going to come right back to that in a second. But I also want to put myself in the shoes of an agency that's trying to buy stuff and do it in an efficient manner and deal with inflation, and saying, look, what we really want to do is make our buys more efficient when we're buying at lower dollar values, and so we're going to increase that floor from $10,000 up to $100,000, so we can just take our purchase card and or whatever other vehicle without dealing with all the paperwork and go get things done. That's the best approach for the taxpayers, and maybe that's true. That's certainly an argument that has some common sense to it. So I see where they're coming from with that. However, that it is true from the small business perspective that what we've done now is we've increased the floor. If this goes through, by the way, this is a proposal. This hasn't happened. This is GSA saying, Congress, in statute, it says $10,000. We would like you to step that up to 100,000 over a 5 year period. If Congress agrees and does that and makes the amendment that OMB has proposed, then the corresponding floor of the requirement to do rule of two acquisitions would also increase from $10,000 to $100,000. And so what you've got there is a reduction by $90,000 of the range in which that threshold would apply. And so we'll forget the ceiling for a second. Let's assume it's still $250,000. You would be going from a $240,000 range to a range of only the $150,000. And so that's a $90,000 reduction, as you said. Now, if you look on the GSA's website, where they have these proposals listed talking about the increasing the simplified acquisition threshold, They don't mention a key part of their proposal. And I'm guessing I know why they didn't mention it, because it's not going to be a popular part when people figure out what's going on there. So they mentioned increasing the simplified acquisition threshold, of course, from the 250 to 10 million over 5 years. Again, understand from the government side why they're going to want to do that. And some contractors are going to say that's great too, because simplified acquisitions can be faster, they can be more efficient, they can be less burdensome from a regulatory perspective. We get why we might want to increase the ability, especially when we're talking about commercial items, and the government's really focused on commercial buys right now. Where I understand that's the best for efficiency for the taxpayers ultimately to do that. Okay, but what they don't mention, and you have to literally go to the red lines, because what GSA did, or OMB, I keep, it's the two of them working together here, did is they've got a summary of their proposals, which is what most people are going to read. Most people read the summary, and then they've got the actual red lines to the statute that they submitted to Congress. They sent the red lines to Congress and said, here's exactly how we want you to line out the statutes and amend them. And what they've done is they've said simplified acquisition threshold, cross out the 250, and then they increase, for commercial items, increasing to 10. Okay, that's what the summary says. We're set there. But they've also gone to the piece of the statute in their proposed red line in which it talks about that mandatory rule of two between the micro purchase and simplified acquisition thresholds. They have lined out the word simplified acquisition threshold and replaced it with $250,000, which is the current simplified acquisition threshold. So what they're proposing to do, GSA and OMB, is not to increase the small business rule of two concurrent with this increase in the simplified acquisition threshold, but rather to freeze it at the current level at $250,000, which means that if this proposal goes through, we're talking about, literally, as I said, a reduction of the range in which small business acquisitions are required by statute from $240,000 to $150,000. That's what they're literally proposing to do with this from a small business perspective. And some folks who are listening to this may recognize the name Guy Timberlake. He's been an advocate in this field for small businesses for a long time, for decades. He went and ran the numbers. I haven't done the math, but I trust Guy's math. And he said that if this had been the case this previous year, in fiscal year 2024, if that range had been narrowed in the way GSA is proposing to do for next year, that small businesses would have lost 1.1 million contracting actions and $4.2 billion in awards. That's what, if you apply that proposal to this year, to the last fiscal year, Guy says would have happened. And again, I have no reason to doubt his math. He's very good at running those numbers. So to me, that's a really alarming proposal, and it's one that's really hidden beneath the radar screen because it's not in the summary that you find on the GSA website. You, again, have to go to the red lines that they propose and understand, follow the bouncing ball and go to the USC and see what this really means. And then you realize, wow, we're talking about a dramatic reduction in the amount of contracts to which the statutory rule of two would apply. That's literally what they're proposing.
Yeah, so even if, like we talked about earlier, there's a bill in Congress to codify the rule of two. So even if the rule of two gets codified by law, but these changes take effect, it's still going to have what effect that you just discussed, right? So
yeah, and so Congress has to decide which way it's going with this, because this is all Congress stuff, So this is OMB saying, here, Congress, here's what we'd like you to do with the rule of two, which is essentially to narrow it substantially. It's not essentially, it is. We want you to narrow the rule of two. Meanwhile, the bills, and there's a companion bill in both the House and Senate to do this, and it was only in the House for a little while, and I was very pleased to see recently that there was a Senate companion bill introduced, and it's bipartisan. It's got two sponsors from each party. That bill would expand the rule of two. And so Congress ain't going to do both things. They're going to have to decide we're doing one or the other, because Congress has, is being asked to amend the statute, or they do nothing and just leave it the way it is. But the Congress is being asked by OMB to do one thing, narrow the rule of two. They're being asked by various members of Congress, as well as many small business advocates, to expand the statutory rule of two to match what's been in the FAR for a long time. And so Congress now has a decision to make as to what it wants to do there.
So if you were to make a suggestion for folks that, small businesses that are concerned about this, what power do they have to influence maybe the way the outcome happens here?
Yeah, I mean, it starts with the basic of contacting your members of Congress because, this sounds like not much. Oh, we're going to lose $100,000 to $10,000 range. That's not that big a deal. But as Guy ran the numbers and showed, that adds up to billions of dollars in contracting, and a lot of small businesses get their start in contracting with contracts of those dollar values. That's how they get their foot in the door. Some of them still do it for years and years, but others, that's their foot in the door. That's how they can get in without a huge record of past performance and all that stuff by doing a $50,000 buy, proving their worth. And so it's really important. And so, your members of Congress, these bills are have been proposed in both House and Senate. They're available for consideration. Contacting your members of Congress and letting them know that you support these bills. If you need more information about the bills, you can reach out to me, send me an email, and I can send you the specific number. HR this and S this, the House and Senate, House of Representatives bill and Senate bill, uh, and let your members of Congress know that you support these bills. If you are part of any industry organizations that are small business type organizations, see if those organizations have put their weight behind these bills yet, because oftentimes there's power in numbers, there's power in groups. And so if you're part of an industry organization that has not yet weighed in on these bills, getting their folks involved could be a helpful push as well. So just keeping the heat on Congress and letting them know that this is really going to hurt small businesses, letting them know the numbers Guy said that, like, this doesn't sound like much, but look, we're talking about billions of dollars in small business contracting. I'm your constituent. I'm going to be hurt by this, and hopefully that will help Congress understand that what they're being asked to do here is going to have real world impacts beyond what the summary says. This, because the summary is all about efficiency and common sense, right? But
Yeah.
is it common sense to reduce the range of the statutory rule of two in this manner? Not to me, it's not.
Yeah. Stephen, I think what I'd like to do is, I'm going to take the transcript from this show today, and I'll put together a little blog posting that maybe you could help to review, and we'll get that up on the Govology blog, or if you want to post it to your newsletter, so that I can understand how it might be challenging for some people to be able to communicate to their
Yeah.
representatives what they
That's
want them
complicated
to fight
stuff,
for,
right?
right?
It's
So,
like this. I mean, think about how much time I took just talking about statute and regulation and rule of two and why this matters. And this is to
yeah,
an audience that, many of folks are already familiar with this lingo and kind of what some of this stuff means. And some members of Congress are too, but many are not. They are
yeah,
asked to be experts in everything the government does. And so some of them know procurement really well, and many of them have no idea. They don't have a
yeah,
background in this. So it could be really challenging trying to explain that. So yeah, I think that's a great idea, Carol. Trying to put this in plain English and get down to brass tacks, which is, this is, I'm your constituent. This is going to hurt me, and
yeah.
here's why.
What would be the ideal outcome for small businesses if they were to advocate for a specific outcome? Is it to keep it like it is now, to codify the rule of two like they got proposed, and then just keep it where it is? Or, if they're going to raise the thresholds, just keep it within the thresholds like it is now?
Yeah, I mean, I think, for me, again, as I'm coming at this as a small business advocate, codify the rule of two. I mean, we've got in statute, because we've been using this rule for decades, and small businesses have been hitting that 23% goal most
Yeah,
years recently, up to 27, 28%. That still means, by the way, that large businesses are getting, 72%, 73% of the dollars. So they're not doing that badly for themselves out there, even under this rule of two. And so I don't think there's a need to, uh, you know, or that it's good public policy for us to eliminate the rule of two statutorily. By putting it in statute, what it just means is that the FAR Council, a regulatory body that's unelected, doesn't have the right to go in and monkey with it. And Congress can always go
hmm,
back in the future and say, no, we changed our minds. We don't think the rule of two. But I think putting it in there simply codifies what we've been doing in the government for years. If the rule of two goes away above the simplified acquisition threshold, I think it's going to be pretty devastating for small businesses. And keep in mind that while the government has been meeting that 23% goal and exceeding it in recent years, that's a dollar goal. and that the number of small businesses that are involved in federal contracting has been on a steady decline for about 15 years now. Last year was about 60,000 some that were involved in federal contracting. It was up over 110, 120,000 15 years ago. So we've had fewer and fewer small businesses involved in federal contracting. If we wipe out the rule of two above the simplified acquisition threshold, or we narrow it so that folks, the small businesses, can't get their foot in the door with low dollar values, we're going to see those numbers drop dramatically more. We're going to have a
Yeah.
much narrower industrial base. So it's
And
not the
it's already
time to be
right.
eliminating these tools. It's not the time to be eliminating these
Yeah, I
tools.
mean the industrial base. I mean, as you've blogged about before, it's already a shrinking industrial base, and the government is trying to figure out how to resolve this problem.
Correct. And
Um,
so if we were saying, okay, we're going to take the primary tool, the rule of two that we use to push work to
right.
small businesses, and get rid of it or narrow it, I mean, it's pretty obvious what that's going to do to the industrial base. That doesn't mean, and some folks are out there saying, that could happen, and some small businesses would still survive and thrive. That's true, but I'll tell you what. Last year there were 60,951. I just pulled it up. Small businesses that sold to government. If you get rid of the rule of two or severely curtail it, it's going to be considerably less than that who are going to be selling moving forward, and that's a public policy decision that Congress needs to make. But we've long held in this country that having a broad industrial base, a broad small business industrial base is good. It's good for this country to have that competition, to have procurement spread about to main streets of different towns in every state in the union, all these sorts of things that small businesses can do to bring innovation, et cetera, to the market. And so if we eliminate this tool and don't replace it with anything, then that number is going to take a nosedive. And that's just, that seems logical and obvious.
Yeah, I think we need to send our own proposals to Congress. So,
That's right. That's right. I'm going to start with like my class at what is the rule of two and why it matters, because
right.
nine Congress people, probably 9.9 out of 10 Congress people don't know that, and that's okay because again, they're not intended to be procurement experts, but it's important that they understand why what seems like an innocuous change and one that's going to increase efficiency. And I don't doubt that it will in terms of just the speed and efficiency of making awards. But if we increase that simplified acquisition threshold to achieve that efficiency, but at the same time cap the rule of two at the current level, 250,000, without an inflationary adjustment that I can see, and then also eliminate the far part that says it applies above. I mean, we're really doing harm to small businesses, and so I hope
Mhm.
that message can get across to Congress because they need to hear it.
Yeah. One more thing on the rule of two before we move on to the next subject matter, which is going to talk about something as it relates to task order and delivery order protests. But when it comes to GSA, because we're looking at and GSA schedules specifically, um, because we're looking at now agencies are you know looking at combining more of the traditional vehicles that have been out there into GSA schedules. Some folks reported that the spending might increase on GSA schedules 4 times. So currently, how does that rule of two or not apply within the context of GSA schedules? Is it just an open market rule, or does it also carry through to GSA?
Yeah, that's a great question because the rule of two is unclear in the statute to the extent to which it applies to task and delivery orders, and so it's essentially gone to a series of GAO bid protests and court decisions. The way it stands right now is that the rule of two does not apply to GSA schedule buys. That there's a exception for those that agencies can do voluntarily small business set asides off the schedule, but they don't have to. For other types of GWACs in which you have small businesses, then there are the court decisions saying, yeah, actually, you do need to apply the rule of two if you have both small and not small businesses on a non-GSA type GWAC. So yeah, just the fact of moving more work over to the schedule could mean that that we have fewer set aside opportunities that for that reason alone, because GSA
Yeah.
schedules are often exempt from rules that apply to other procurements, even sometimes to other task and delivery order procurements. It's treated as a separate thing, and so that's a good point, Carol. That just moving that money over could have that impact. And I get what the administration's doing with this kind of this consolidation. They're looking at best-in-class vehicles and moving work to existing vehicles rather than inventing new ones, because there is an efficiency argument to be made there too. And some folks will say, no, 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 we saw history where GSA was trying to do buys for other agencies, and that didn't go so well in
Yeah.
the past. And so there definitely views on different sides, but anyone who had to deal with a CIO SP4 over the last however many years that's been, maybe of the mindset like maybe we shouldn't, have every agency going out and putting out these GWACs and doing that stuff, because it hasn't always worked out so well.
I want to talk about really quickly uh, VA, because wasn't this part of the big Kingdomware case where the VA was essentially saying that the rule of two for veteran SDVOSB and veteran-owned small business procurements didn't apply to the GSA schedule. So in a way, if it went in GSA, the VA was like, well, it doesn't really count at this level, but they were like, yes, it does. And the Supreme Court found that, the intent was that it does, right? You want
Yeah,
to
that's
recap that one?
yeah, so
Because
that's right. And
what I'm
that's a
thinking
that's a
here
di
is, you go ahead.
yeah, so that's a different rule of two. There's multiple rules of two in the
Yeah.
government. It's not the one we've been talking about under FAR 19.5022. What we're talking about now is a VA specific rule called, which is known as the Veterans First policy, which is itself statute. And so now we're not talking about something that's in the FAR. We're talking about a statutory policy that the VA prioritize veterans, and the VA alone among agencies has this hierarchy statutorily where they are supposed to first. If the rule of two, essentially two or more SDVOSB, service disabled veteran owned small businesses, are available, then you set aside for them or do a sole source there. If not, then you go to veteran-owned small businesses. VA is the only agency that has authority to do set aside and sole source contracts for VOSBs. And then down the chain to other types of small businesses, and eventually to large. And so, the VA, when that statute was first passed, took the position that as is the case with the small business rule of two under the FAR, that the GSA schedule is essentially an exception to the SDVOSB VOSB rule of two under the VA statutes. And that case went all the way to the Supreme Court must have been almost 9 years ago now, or so it's been a while. And Supreme Court said, nope, the statute's clear, and UVA have an obligation to apply this STVOSB VOSB rule of two. The GSA schedule is not an exception for you. Nice try. And that was a unanimous Supreme Court decision, 8-0. One justice seat was empty at the time. So, but that does not mean that the small business rule of two under the FAR applies to GSA schedule. It's a different rule of two, and it came
Right.
from statutory authority that in the Supreme Court's mine too, was pretty clear. It didn't have any exceptions for the GSA schedule, and that's different than the rule of two for small businesses.
Yeah. So I guess at the end of the day, what would be nice to see is that, even if they do move those thresholds, that they keep the rule of two intact within any thresholds that they raise it within, codified into law. And it would be also great if they also, did like the VA did, or the Supreme Court said, where, you have to use it in the GSA schedules as well, because I mean, this is the purpose of giving small business opportunity. And with a lot of the procurements, if you were to study any of the NAICS codes, and you can go to some of the sites we use, kind of HireGov, go to the vehicle spend, like 90% of spending a lot of times in some of these vehicles are within GSA schedules. So in a way, if they're using GSA schedule for 90% of their procurements, they've kind of got an out from the small business rule of two anyway. So that shouldn't be, I think that should be fixed as well.
Yes, I mean, from a small business advocate perspective, I absolutely agree. It's a loophole, and so while we're at it, why not close that loophole as well? And I know there'll be pushback from some in government saying, oh, that increases our paperwork and lowers efficiency and et cetera, et cetera. So that's a debate that could be had. For me, of course, I'm a small business advocate. I say, yeah, I mean, why have a giant loophole sitting out there for avoiding the rule of two? But in the moment, we're kind of we for rule of two folks are kind of on defense right now. We're playing
Right.
defense against cutting it down because potential for in the ways we've discussed to really limit that rule of two to so we're playing defense. Hopefully at some point we can go on the offense on behalf of
Yeah.
small businesses and say, hey, Congress, while we're at it, let's close the loopholes here. Let's do because VA was and again, these are attorneys who are going to, spin things for them. But the VA's attorneys were all like, "Ah, this guy's going to totally fall if we have to do Rule 2 off the schedule and all this sort of stuff." It didn't fall. It meant that they did more buys with SDVOSBs.
Yeah.
They did just fine. They implemented it and. All right, no problem, no problem. So, and again, attorneys and I've been one in my career. We can be prone to a little hyperbole when we're arguing on behalf of our clients. But if you just looked at what the attorneys for VA were arguing, you would think that the VA itself is going to implode if we had to do the rule of two for veterans, 10 years ago, instead of doing scheduled buys. And of course, it didn't happen. Of course, it
Yeah.
didn't happen.
Yeah. And the other reason why this is all important is because, small businesses come into this landscape with really limited experience and performance that maybe the large firms would have. And so if that's where most of the acquisitions are going, it's already hard enough for them to compete. And so, again, having this small business set asides are very important because it gives them a little bit of a sheltered area to be able to do some work that's not competing up against the large firms where they're going to be disadvantaged even more by a lack of that experience and performance, economics, and everything else that goes within. So,
Yeah.
all righty, let's move to the last topic. Well, and we'll kind of get through this one maybe a little bit quicker, but this one is on task and delivery order protest threshold parity. So this says that this proposal would increase the protest threshold for task and delivery orders under multiple award contracts from $10 million to $35 million for civilian agencies, matching the Department of Defense's threshold, which was most recently raised in 2024. So would you like to talk about that one and what should contractors understand about this one in particular?
Yeah, and so I mean, I think that's a fair summary of what the proposal is, unlike the other one, which on the simplified acquisition threshold, I thought they left out an important part of the proposal in the summary, which is the cap on the the relationship to the rule of two. But yeah, so the way it currently stands is that when you're filing bid protests, challenging the award of a procurement with either the GAO or the Court of Federal Claims, there are separate rules that apply when you're challenging a task or delivery order award. And generally speaking, the Court of Federal Claims doesn't have jurisdiction to hear those protests. This is all done in the interest of efficiency and that sort of thing. And the GAO, the Government Accountability Office, has authority, but only over certain dollar values. And so those dollar values have been steadily increasing throughout the years as Congress has listened to the pleas of the government. Which, of course, remember this proposal is coming from OMB and GSA, which is not a DoD entity saying. We don't like protests. We don't like when people challenge our work. Please make it harder for folks to protest. And that's an argument that people can have. I think that I think it's important when we have the debate about increasing protest thresholds, which really is just a question of do we want to make it harder or impossible for people, contractors, to file protests in certain cases? Because what we're talking about here is saying if you have a non-DoD contract task or delivery order under 35 million, no matter what the agency does to screw it up, you can't challenge that. Is that something we want? Well, the government says, yeah, we want that. we of course we want that. We want to wipe out protests entirely. As if they could get away with that, they probably would want that, and I understand that from their perspective. But I do think it's important to keep in mind the facts. And the question is because what you often hear is everything's getting protested. We're drowning in protests. I even saw that headline several years ago saying drowning in protests. And the answer is we're not. In fiscal year 2024 at GAO, and which is most of the protests are filed at GAO, there are about 1,800 protests total. The number of protests has dropped about 30% in the last 10 years. for various reasons. One is increasing thresholds here. Another is that contractors are getting more enhanced debriefings, which gives them more information to decide whether or not to protest. And so, and I think most importantly, the so-called effectiveness rate of the protests at GAO has been pretty consistent around 50% over the last 10 years or so. And what does effectiveness rate mean? That means either the protester wins flat out, gets a sustain, or the agency voluntarily takes corrective action, says, whoops, we messed something up.
Yeah.
We're going to go back and switch. So what that tells me is that, and by the way, at DOD, the GAO recently published a stat saying about 1.5% of acquisitions are protested at DOD. And so protests are not all that common, and they are frequently successful. And by successful, I don't necessarily mean the protester gets the contract. That's sometimes what people deem, oh, if I don't get the contract, I'm being successful. And that's fair. That's it from an industry perspective. When you file a protest, that's what you want, right? But a successful protest in terms of identifying flaws in the procurement process that lead to potentially an agency taking corrective action that may or may not award the contract to the protester, but they're going to fix something that they did wrong. That happens about 50% of the time. So about 50% of the time, a protest does identify an actual acknowledged flaw in the procurement process. And so I think keeping these things in mind when we're talking about proposals to make it harder or impossible to protest is important. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't necessarily do that. There are arguments to be had for just that, saying, well, we want to streamline acquisitions, we want to be more efficient, we don't want people looking over the shoulder. Okay, we can have that, but not from the perspective of hyperbole about everything's getting protested, or protests are almost always frivolous and they almost always lose. Those just aren't true facts. Like, the facts are out there. So I hope that we have those conversations as this proposal goes to Congress, and as other proposals. There's currently a proposal to have a loser pays the fees for certain protest proposal. As those go in front of Congress, they understand that protests are an important component of keeping the government honest, about keeping procurements transparent and fair, and that there's a price to be paid. The more that we make it difficult to protest or impossible to protest, the less transparent the process becomes. It's a trade-off. It really is. And so that's my context for it. That I want Congress to have the facts in front of them about the frequency of protests and the effectiveness rate in terms of identifying flaws in the procurement process, and use that to decide whether it's makes sense to continue to make protests more difficult to file.
All right. Awesome. Well, hey, those were really three great topics that Steve and I both think that you guys should watch and also get involved with. Again, Stephen, I'd love to work with you on putting together something that we could put on our blogs, and you could maybe post something also on your newsletter. And which, by the way, for those of you guys who are not already subscribed to Stephen's GovCon Roundup newsletter, which inspired the show that we're doing today, encourage you to look for it on LinkedIn. You could just Google GovCon Roundup LinkedIn, and you should be able to find it there, and join Stephen's newsletter. He puts out some really great updates all the time to kind of keep folks in the know. So, and then we're also going to be, that could be one way that we kind of notify folks of some of this. Whatever we can put together, I think would be helpful. And we'll also post it on the Govology blog. And for those of you guys who are in our Govology community, we'll likely, when we do have that, we'll get it sent out on an email, because I really believe it's important for small businesses to also be able to put together some proposals to Congress. Because like right now, you've got the government making proposals, and without any other proposals coming in, they may just look at what's being proposed and say, okay, right. So I think it's important that we make the voice heard for small business. So Stephen, thank you so much for this overview, for the insights as always. This is going to conclude episode 3. So thank you guys for joining us, and we're going to see you guys on the next episode. But we're also going to do a Q&A before we head out here today. So we've got some questions in the queue. And again, if you guys want to ask your question live, you can raise your hand, and not your real hand, but the virtual hand in the control panel.
I mean, you can raise your real hand. Everybody's not gonna see it, so that's
right.
cool.
So,
you can do it if you want. You raise both hands. I don't care. It's cool.
So here we go, Stephen. I'm going to read some of these questions out to you. And the first one is, what do we think the timeline of implementation for this would be? Have we seen a FAR overhaul like this in the past that could be a historical indicator for timelines?
Yeah, so I think we've got two different things going on there. And you mentioned at the outset what a wacky and crazy year this is for procurement overhaul, right? So we've got two things now going on. We've got the what's called they're calling now the RFO, or Revolutionary Far Overhaul, which makes me think, I was just in Boston not long ago. It makes me think that like folks pitching tea into the harbor. But what we're doing is overhauling the FAR. That's a process that's going on within the FAR Council and the OMB. It's a regulatory process, and that is being driven by an executive order that President Trump issued. I want to say March, something like that. There is a time frame on that. They're doing this revolutionary FAR overhaul where they're streamlining the FAR, they're lining out pieces of it, all that stuff. That's supposed to be done, I believe, in maybe mid-October, something like that. There's a timeline in the executive order to get that done. And so when you see these proposed pieces of the revolutionary fire overhaul that are coming out, those are done because they've got a ticking clock. Like that group that's doing that RFO has a deadline under the executive order that gave them about 6 months to get that process done. Which to me, I'm like, sometimes the FAR Council in the past took literally like 5 years to take an SBA regulation and copy it into the FAR. Now they're overhauling the whole FAR in 6 months. I'm like, that's pretty impressive, but they're not necessarily used to that level of work, but they're getting it done. So that's one process that's going on. Keep in mind that that is what Carol and I were talking about is not it's going on a parallel track, but it's not that process, because that's the process of regulations that that are not mandated by statute, right? And so the pieces of the FAR that the FAR Council, in its own regulatory authority, that was responding to broader congressional mandates, like make small businesses have a fair opportunity, and we'll leave it to your discretion to do that. Those pieces of the FAR are subject to rewrite at the direction of the executive, in this case the president, and at the discretion of the FAR Council. And so they're doing that. But there are pieces of this puzzle then that only Congress can change. Like when we talk about the USC, we're back to the USC, only Congress can change that. And so the three items we talked about today, in terms of raising the micro purchase threshold, raising the simplified acquisition threshold, and raising the bid protest threshold for civilian task and delivery orders, only Congress can switch those things. And so that's why GSA, OMB have gone to Congress and said, hey, we're busy working on this RFO over here, but there are pieces of this we can't do. We would like you to do it for us that we think are good. And so that's up to Congress how they want to handle that. Like, this is literally just a proposal to Congress. If Congress wanted to pass all of this tomorrow, they could. That's not generally how Congress works. They don't generally put this stuff in play the next day, but they could. More likely is that any pieces of this that gets passed are going to probably be baked into a broader piece of legislation, such as a National Defense Authorization Act. The House and Senate are both working on the 2026 National Defense Authorization Act, which a lot of contracting policy is often baked into those bills that affect both the DoD and other agencies. This request may not make it into the 2026 NDAA, so maybe it would be the pieces Congress wants to push through might be the next year's NDAA, 2027 NDAA. We'll see. But that's the timeline for that is going to be totally up to Congress. Congress can, by the way, can look at this and just be like, yeah, we don't care. We're not going to do anything with it. It's up to Congress what they want to do with this, and so there's no specific timeline on to when that needs to get done. I would expect that some of these do become law. If my best guess is if that does, we're looking at next year for some of this to maybe become law. That's just a total guess. And of 16 proposals, Congress being Congress, half of them may become law and the other half won't. I mean, that's just kind of how Congress works.
Yeah. All righty. So the next question is regarding industry organizations that are putting their weight behind these bills. Is Apex acting on this? I can probably answer that question. And I will say that, and specifically, they're referring to Apex accelerators. Apex accelerators themselves are not lobbyists. But I do think that what they can help with is that, once we get a little bit of a blog article, I know that we've probably got some Apex Accelerator counselors and program managers on this call with us today. But I think what they can do and what they will do is that once we get some information out there and we get this little blog put out that we were talking about, they could disseminate that to their clients and encourage them to go out and make their voices heard to their representatives. But the other thing is that also, getting involved with some of those organizations. In the last episode, we talked about some success that WIP, the Women Impacting Public Policy, has had. So if you're a WOSB, we definitely encourage check out joining up with that organization. And there's other GovCon industry related organizations. So if you're part of one of them, bring some of these topics up to the leadership and make sure that those folks are advocating for you guys, because they have some specific folks that do that part for small business. So this is an important time that we make sure that the voices get heard by small businesses and not just kind of from one side that's not necessarily having the favor of small businesses in mind. Um, Go ahead, Stephen. Did you have a?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, Apex, it's a great question. Apex is, of course, funded in large part by the federal government, and generally speaking, you can't use government dollars to turn around lobby the government. So my guess is Apex would say we can't do that. We're restricted from doing that. But just what Carol said, the industry groups like WIP, there are groups out there for hub zones and for 8A and for veterans and for small businesses more generally speaking. So a lot of these folks do have lobbying arms. They go once or twice a year to Capitol Hill and have lobbying days where they know the staff and they're invited in, and so it can make it like I said, there can be value in those numbers and with the established relationships that some of these groups have to get these issues like this in front of the policymakers.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that this next question was kind of related similarly, asking if SBA can lobby Congress to help members understand what they're voting on. Because they will be inundated by large corporations. Small businesses can't compete with those lobbying efforts.
Yeah, and so SBA, of course, itself is a government agency. It doesn't do lobbying in the terms that we think of it, in terms of, going in and, shaking hands and sitting down and trying to pitch your case. However, there's nothing stopping SBA from doing exactly what OMB and GSA have done here, which is say, well, okay, we're an agency in the federal government too. We have a different perspective. We ask you, Congress, to do this, that, or the other. They're certainly allowed to do that. I don't know that they have, at least not publicly, maybe behind the scenes. I hope that some members of Congress will reach out to SBA and say, "Hey, we're hearing that these proposals could have negative impacts on small business. Can you give us a read on that?" But yeah, nothing stopping SBA from doing what OMB and GSA have done here too, and having a different perspective. And sometimes you do see that SBA will have a different perspective than another agency because SBA's mandate is to support small businesses.
Yeah, absolutely. And the last one here is just a comment, and we're going to close up shop. But I want to leave out with a few thoughts here as well for everyone, and then we'll give Stephen the Jerry Springer final thoughts here. But the last comment is great info. Thank you for the update and overview. Some talking point slash outline would be very useful to help us fight for our small businesses. Greatly appreciated. So thank you, Jennifer, for that comment. So Stephen, here we are at the end of the show here, the end of the Q&A. We've had a really great discussion. And I think it's important again, and we're going to work together to get some information out to you guys that you can just simply forward along, right? Because again, we understand that it might be hard to communicate exactly what you want. So I'd like to, have a chat with Stephen and how do we kind of really put together something that's concise. And I think it's important both when we do get this out to you to do a forward on to your individual representatives, ask them to basically, stand up for small businesses because it's not just about like putting a bunch of money into the pockets of small businesses, which is a very important thing to do, but it also is just good for the government overall. And I think that in the efforts of trying to streamline acquisitions, the government is maybe missing some other things that could result in a negative outcome for them.
Yeah, I
That's
mean
it.
that's long been recognized, and of course there are often competing policies. That's why we
Yeah,
have people in Congress who can hopefully do a smart job of weighing these things. But yeah, you're trying to streamline procurements. You're trying to get rid of protests. Okay, but we talked about how there's a balance there between that and transparency, and the same is true for items that would shrink the pool of small business acquisitions, the set asides, that sort of thing. That's going to mean fewer small businesses in the marketplace. Now,
yeah,
that's a trade-off that we can choose to make, but one of the key reasons that we established this policy in the first place is because it was deemed a long-term good for this country to have a broad base, a broad industrial base of everything, and
yeah.
to help small businesses in all parts of the country on every main street in America have the opportunity to sell their good or service to Uncle Sam, to grow in that marketplace, because ultimately it increases competition, it
Right.
increases innovation, all those things that small businesses can do. And so if we shrink that industrial base in the name of efficiency, that's a trade-off that we can choose, but I think we need to do it with eyes wide open that's a trade-off we're choosing.
Yeah, and I mean, it was like I think the mid '80s when the Apex Accelerator back then, called PTAX, back, but was established in part because the government was like, why are we paying like $100 for a hammer? And
Mhm.
part of this whole study was that, like, there was just so little competition because it was so complex, and over these years, a lot of efforts have been made to basically build more competition. And so we don't want to go back to the point to where, you know, uh, everybody's just like, it's so unfavorable. Everybody just says, well, to heck with it, and steps out. And now you've only got a few players in there that are basically like jacking up the prices again. So again, I think this is important not just for small businesses, but for the government and the taxpayers on the whole. So uh, anyway, Stephen, that's it for the day. Do you have any last thoughts before we head out?
Not really. I'm not going to go Jerry Springer on you with the chair or whatever you mentioned there. I appreciate everyone joining us today. I mean, I hope that the passion what I have for small business, I'm sure comes through here. I do encourage everyone to go ahead and subscribe to the to my LinkedIn newsletter, which is free, GovCon Roundup. If you like hearing what's going on in the small business marketplace, is totally free. It's got dad jokes. I mean, we've got almost 10,000 folks subscribed now, so I guess people like it.
That's
So
awesome,
please
man.
go ahead and do that. But I'm looking forward to our next chat, Carol. These are a lot of fun.
Yeah, absolutely, Stephen. Thank you all for joining us today, and we'll see you next month on GovCon Roundup Live. Take care, everyone.